Okay, number 10. This is a series of ships that were super important when they first launched because they created an absolute sensation and stole the blue ribbon and well, earned the blue ribbon, very, very rightly so. The first of the bunch, Kaiser Wilhelm de Grosse, again, just caused an absolute sensation when she was first introduced in the 1890s. The whole four-stacker thing, you can trace its origins here. It reminds me a little bit of Dreadnought, HMS Dreadnought, the warship, because a few ships through history, like Dreadnought, have started an arms race. You know, Dreadnought was introduced in, I think, 1909, and then any ship before Dreadnought was known as a pre-Dreadnought warship. So it was so important that every navy in the world suddenly had to copy or emulate that design. Originally, Kaiser Wilhelm de Grosse, the first ship was meant to be a standalone, and after that ship created a sensation, they built the second ship, the third, Kaiser Wilhelm II, and finally, Kronprinzessin Cecilia, Crown Princess Cecily. And what's interesting about Kronprinzessin Cecilia is that she had the most powerful quadruple expansion steam engines ever fitted to an ocean liner. So an absolute beast of a thing. The interiors of these ships were stunning, extremely Teutonic, but you know, little details like the angels painted up here and the roof, the stunning design of a lot of this timber paneling. You know, it was very of the era, but extremely beautiful. It would have been extremely comfortable, and for the first time in history, you could get across the Atlantic in, was it a 6-day crossing? But very, very quick for the time. A few of them were captured, or rather interned, and then put to use by the Americans after the First World War. One was lost in action, but just, you know, legendary ships. Alrighty, number 9. Here we go. Number 9, top ocean liner of all time, Rex. This is one of my favorite photos of any ocean liner ever because it's got one of my favorite aeroplanes in it, which is the B-17 Flying Fortress. You can see a pair of B-17s here. The Rex, again, another ship that caused an absolute sensation on launch in 1931. British shipping companies at this point had stagnated a little bit. They'd been relying so heavily on a number of ships that were, you know, either pre or just post World War I, and suddenly Europe, like, you know, European shipping lines start creating absolutely beautiful and extremely fast liners like Rex and her running mate Conte di Savoia. So these two I'm grouping together as running mates. Absolutely gorgeous ships as well. Like Conte di Savoia from the exterior has got to be one of the most beautiful ocean liners of all time, and it's an absolute tragedy what happened to these ships during the Second World War, because, you know, the Italian fleet was decimated. They were kind of like sitting ducks. The Royal Air Force got them. So, you know, it would have been absolutely marvelous to see one of these survive the Second World War and see what happened to them, and what kind of career they could have had. So it is sad to see what happened to those beautiful ships. But I just wanted to show you this. This is Conte di Savoia's dining room and a bottle of Peroni Nastro Azzurro, which is a beer which I have, in my time, been seen to imbibe on occasion. But the interesting thing about Peroni is that the Nastro Azzurro part of Peroni Nastro Azzurro stands for blue ribbon. And you can see the blue ribbon logo, which they still use to this day. And that was in honor of Rex originally taking the blue ribbon on her introduction in the early 30s. And so still, when you have a bottle of Peroni now, it's in honor of Rex. So they may have been destroyed and met sad ends during the Second World War, but we can still crack a beverage to them in honor. Bremen and Europa, I just mentioned them, but the first ships almost of their class, I would say. They were superliners, but designed absolutely for speed. And so suddenly you have these monstrous ships, 40 or 50,000 tons, that are doing, you know, the high 20s or, you know, low 30 knots across the North Atlantic. So some absolute technological marvels here. Technologically speaking, these ships are spectacular. Europa followed suit as well. I think they're beautiful looking ships. They introduced things like this, so you could send mail on ahead before arriving in New York. But again, ships that caused an absolute sensation when they first showed up. So yeah, I'm obsessed with these ships. Again, I could just look at them all day. Aren't they beautiful? All right, so moving on. Number 7 is a pair of ships that are kind of out of their time. We've got Queen Elizabeth II and Queen Mary II. Now, I'm grouping these two together because very, very briefly they served as running mates in the early 2000s. But the reason these are on my list kind of high is because QE2 is really a legend. In fact, everyone knows her as QE2, not Queen Elizabeth II. You could say QE2 to anybody, especially where I'm at in Australia, and everybody would know that you're talking about this ship, right? So they could see it in their head because it was such a regular visitor to Australia. I used to walk out and look at her coming into Port Melbourne with my dad. Obviously, my opinion's a little biased here, right? So I just love this ship. And I might also add, played a role and served Britain in the Falklands War, and served as a troop ship. And you might notice that there's one thing that almost every pick has on this list is that they served at some point, one of the class served as a troop ship at some point. And Queen Mary too, one of the absolute great pleasures of the last few months, or just over lockdown, was I got to speaking with Stephen Payne, who was the chief naval architect on the Queen Mary 2 project. And Stephen is clearly an absolute Oceanliner fanatic. He frequently writes articles for the magazine Ships Monthly over in the UK, and covering hundreds of different Oceanliners from all different countries, and he knows them all so well. He wrote an article and I provided illustrations for him on P&O's Far East service, so the Canton and the Chusan. And he just is such a wealth of knowledge. So to have someone like that who's so knowledgeable on these subjects design an Oceanliner, and you can see visual elements from Oceanliners from history that he's very open about saying, well, I was inspired by this. So for the immediate example that comes to mind is the breakwater on Queen Mary 2's bow, being very, very similar to that from Normandie. So, Queen Mary 2 has to qualify. She's an Oceanliner, and therefore she deserves a spot on this list. I know a lot of people say the ship's someone in the comments just said it's an overqualified cruise ship. Most of her life is spent cruising, but you can go on this ship and get the closest thing to experiencing what the glamour of the golden era of being on an Oceanliner must have been like. Number six. All right, we're getting through this at a good rate. Number 6, we'll get through these really quick because I don't think these need any introduction. I don't know if any of you guys have ever heard of this ship before, but this was an Oceanliner. It was built by Harland and Wolff in the 1910s, and nothing at all interesting happened with this trio of ships. Nothing interesting at all. Basically, Olympic has earned this spot alone, despite her, her 2 sister ships. Take them out of the picture for a second, but let's just talk about Olympic real quick, because Olympic had such an incredible career, alongside the likes of her rivals like the Mauritania. But to take a ship that was built in the Edwardian era through to the First World War, to have done so much insane stuff in the First World War, running down German submarine, transporting thousands and thousands of men across the Atlantic. She earned the nickname Old Reliable, and then to come out into the 20s and have this brilliant, limelight career. Man, it's got to be one of the most legendary ships of all time. The sequel, as always, not so good as the first film. Yeah, look, Titanic, the legendary status is off the charts, but as far as career, she never had the chance. But you just wonder what life would have been like. Would have probably just had a normal career. Britannic is a ship that's different very much to Olympic and Titanic because a number of improvements were implemented. She had more bathrooms, which is crucial because by the 20s and 30s, people expected to have bathrooms en suite. And on Titanic and Olympic, even in first class, these bathrooms are shared, they're communal. It's not impossible to think that Britannic could have gone on to have a longer career. And I like to imagine her kind of going Aquitania's way and just making it to the Second World War, where she was meant to be retired, but then being brought back in as a troop ship. And it would have been very cool seeing Britannic in World War II parked in Sydney Harbour. Yeah, number 5. Woo! Number 5. The Ballin Trio. But Imperator is one of these ships that when she was released, or launched, it was an absolute sensation. Again, an absolute monstrous ship that supplanted Britain's liners. Once again, that, Britain is directly inspired. When Imperator was launched, she sparks this fear in British shipbuilding that, again, a European nation that isn't Britain is on top of the tonnage and, the sheer size and luxury. The interiors of these ships were very, very beautiful. The story of these ships is fascinating because, of course, given that they were confiscated, interned, after the First World War by the Allies, and then some of Britain's biggest shipping companies had the opportunity to buy them at token prices or be awarded them as prizes. So of course, Cunard had lost Lusitania, and so in her place, they get a nice shiny new German superliner, the Berengaria. It was originally Imperator. White Star Line received Bismarck and renamed her Majestic. Absolutely legendary career, and Majestic became a firm favorite on the transatlantic run. One of my favorite stories about Majestic is featured in one of the biographies of White Star Line's Commodore, and he mentioned that when he went on board Majestic to take command of her for the first time, the German crew who were still staying on board, their cabins, because the ship was unfinished largely, the German crew's cabins were fine, they were finished. But for some reason, his cabin and the British crew's cabins were full of junk, and they hadn't been cleaned out yet. For some weird reason, I don't know why. And lastly, Leviathan. Now, what's really interesting about this ship is that a young William Francis Gibbs and his brother Frederick had to reverse engineer this ship with their team. So they were a young duo working, they had their own naval architecture firm, and one of the first big jobs they're awarded is to reverse engineer this ship because the plans were still in Germany and they were being held ransom for like a, obscene amount. So they just took their team and literally went through every possible space and nook and cranny of this ship and drew thousands and thousands of plans so that then she could be stripped and refitted as an American liner. And so Leviathan was never hugely popular through the 20s, although that maybe could have had more to do with the Volstead Act, the passing of the Volstead Act and Prohibition, which meant that she was largely alcohol-free as far as I'm aware. However, her competitors, you could still have a cocktail on board the Majestic and the Berengaria. Maybe not so much the Leviathan. So maybe that had something to do with it. Legendary ships, they had really, really interesting careers, and I think they have earned their spot. Number 4, we're getting to the pointy end of this list. Normandie, again, if we're talking about ships that on introduction were absolutely legends, Normandie's got to be one of them. Normandy was spectacular, right? It would be a totally different and strange experience to traveling on Queen Mary, where things are nice and comfy and homely. This ship is alien, and she incorporates so many technological facets that were, although by themselves not revolutionary, when assembled into one ship, I think totally out there, and it was a huge jump and a huge leap for French Line to take, building this ship in the first place. And as a symbol of national pride, I think France could do no better than a ship like Normandie, and I think she was a real beauty of a ship, and totally unique. So I think she really earns her spot as one of the greatest liners purely for her presence. I know she didn't have the best career. Again, a ship that was kind of lost early in her prime. It would have been interesting to see what French Line did with her after the Second World War if she had survived. And then following on from that, France is that, after the Second World War, when Normandy was lost in that fire, France, being such a proud nation, needed a ship to compete. And although unfortunately France was introduced right at the tail end of the era of the Oceanliner, I think she earns a spot on this list, if not only for the fact that France would go on to have an incredible career, a total weird second career with Norwegian Cruise Lines as Norway, and become a legendary ship in her own right. Almost like a totally separate ship. It shouldn't have worked. I mean, she's a transatlantic ocean liner, for goodness sake, serving as a cruise ship that she served all the way into the 2000s. It qualifies for legend status. So I think, these two liners go hand in hand. Of course, never served together at the same time, but a spiritual successor and really the pride and the heart and soul of France. Okay, with that out of the way, number 3, you might know these two ships. This is handy because for the first time in this list, I've been able to get 2 of the running mates into the same photograph. Where do we even begin with these? I mean, America is just a ship that is one of my favorites for the whole scope of her career. She was introduced in the 30s, designed by a fella I mentioned earlier who worked on the Leviathan project, William Francis Gibbs. In fact, both of these ships were. America was really a huge leap forward when you think about where United States lines and just the state of American shipping was before America. America was really a jump into the Deco era. She was a much more modern appearing liner. Would go on to have this crazy career as the Australis, when she was sold to Chandris Lines. And, you know, like at that point, America, most ships probably would have gone to the scrappers, you know, but it's like, again, the career as Australis was so long through the 60s and then 70s that it's like a second ship, you know? So a lot of people have very, very fond memories of America as Australis going between Australia and Europe. The United States, do I have a photo of the United States? That's not a nice photo. I should have got a better one. We'll go back to this. You know, again, legendary ship, unfortunately kind of came in at just the right time to be superseded by the jetliner. And if she had been introduced a little earlier, she would have been a smash hit, I'm sure, because getting across the Atlantic in like 4 or 5 days, very appealing, very appealing. Although getting across the Atlantic in 12 hours on an aeroplane, maybe more appealing if you have to get somewhere in a hurry. The United States, I think, is a very special ship. The ship is still here. We still have it. You can still go to Philadelphia and look at it. You can even go to IKEA and have a couple of meatballs and then come out and, and look at the United States. You know, if the ship is still here, it's still having an impact on people who see it. And I would just love to see this ship repainted in her original glory and operating again on the world's oceans. So fingers crossed. I really hope that we can keep this ship. Number two, for a trio of ships that again had such extraordinary careers, we'll start with the first of the three that didn't have the most extraordinary career. Lusitania was a ship whose pedigree was absolutely spectacular. She was built at John Brown in Scotland. So the builder, she's already been built by one of the greatest shipbuilders of all time. She would have had an extraordinary career into the 20s had she not been torpedoed. I wanted to mention Lusitania, of course, because she was the favorite through the 1910s and just an absolute celebrity at sea. So Lusitania deserves a mention. Mauretania, on the other hand, was a legend because she had time to become a legend after the First World War into the 20s, but having served as a troop ship, as a favorite of starlets, even it's not the most glorious part of her career, I guess, but the booze cruises that she was running during Prohibition, you know, she gets loaded up with, you know, university students and partygoers. You just imagine what kind of insane party that would have been on board this ship. But just the name alone makes you just think of the golden era of ocean liners. But probably the very tip top of this class is Aquitania. To point out here, right? So these are three ships in one bucket, and this is why they earn their spot in number 2, because the career of Aquitania alone would earn that ship a spot somewhere on the list. But when you combine that with the legendary status of Lusitania, you know, for having been lost and that weird thing that we all get as ocean liner nerds for ships that sink, and Mauretania for having this legendary career, you combine all these together and you have three ships that were designed to run together that are, I think, that would have to be in the second spot for greatest ocean liners of all time. I mean, Aquitania, introduced just in time for the First World War, you know, serves as a troop ship through that war, serves all the way through the 20s and into the 30s, and then serves as a troop ship during the Second World War, and then as a liner again after World War II. It's truly extraordinary. This ship is a legend and was absolutely beautiful on the inside. Her interiors were stunning. In order to have a successful regular Atlantic service, you really needed three liners of similar class, and that's what White Star obviously comprehended when they introduced Olympic, Titanic, and Britannic. This ship was designed to emulate the Olympic class, whereas Mauretania and Lusitania were in a certain gross tonnage tier. Aquitania was a leap forward in that. She was a lot bigger. She took cues from the Olympic class, and she wasn't designed to break the speed record and hold the blue ribbon, but rather to sell on sheer luxury, which she definitely did. Here we go. Number one ocean liner of all time. The motor vessel Johan van Oldenbarnevelt and her sister ship, the Marnix van Sint Aldegonde. No, just kidding. No points for guessing. No points for guessing what my number one pick is. It's the Queen Mary and the Queen Elizabeth, ladies and gentlemen. I cannot think of another pair of ships that have had as big an impact on society as Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth. Titanic aside, right? Titanic, we all know because she sank. And the story and Olympics career is fascinating, right? But for decades, the Queen Mary was such a cultural corner piece. You cannot overstate how famous these two liners were in their day. And I used to speak to my grandma a little about this kind of stuff. And as a girl growing up in remote Western Australia in Dalwallinu on a cattle station, she knew about the Queen Mary. They all knew about the Queen Mary. The Queen Mary was the very pinnacle of what an ocean liner could be. Of course, when she was introduced, the Queen Mary was a little bit of an odd ship. Externally, extremely traditional, and on the inside, very comfy, but maybe, you know, deco, but in some cases and in some ways maybe a little safe, you know, timber clad. And then scale it up again for the Queen Elizabeth. Look at this thing. I mean, the Queen Elizabeth looks like an absolutely monstrous ship. But again, beautiful on the inside. And I look at that ship and think invincible, which I know sounds ridiculous because we know no ship is unsinkable, but what an absolute masterpiece of naval architecture and maritime engineering. Of course, these two ships could carry each something like 15 or 16,000 men during the Second World War, an entire division of troops in one crossing. And they were so fast that the U-boat fleet couldn't catch them. They're truly extraordinary. It's really amazing to think that these ships had such an impact before the Second World War, during the Second World War, and then after the Second World War. And to that point, both of them were due to be preserved. So Queen Mary, we still have today. And you can go and see it. And so she's still inspiring generations of kids and even adults to think and experience what it would have been like to walk the decks of an ocean liner. And Queen Elizabeth probably would have been here today as well, because she was earmarked to become a floating university. But of course, she burned in Hong Kong Harbour in the 70s, which is a tragedy. You can imagine in an alternate reality being able to go and visit Queen Elizabeth somewhere in the world and then visit Queen Mary. It's amazing. And even the sound of Queen Mary's Typhon horn just gives me a shiver still. It is the sound of an ocean liner. Beautiful, beautiful ships. So again, really hard to imagine ships that have had a broader, deeper impact on society as a whole than Queen Mary and Queen Elizabeth. So there you have it. Thank you for attending my TED Talk. Stay safe and stay happy. And as always, I'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.